For those who haven't heard, Stanford University is facing a federal complaint for allowing anti-Semitism to be ignored by the school's diversity, equity, and inclusion program, including allowing one professor to discuss a program that will explore how Jews are connected to white supremacy, and letting DEI leaders dismiss allegations of Zoom bombings with swastikas because they were concerned that might draw attention away from anti-Black or anti-racism concerns. The school's own investigation even confirmed that its employees engaged in the harassment of Jewish employees. And joining Campus Reform to talk about this is Brandeis Center's founder, Kenneth Marcus. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about these serious allegations.
Good to be with you, Peter.
What makes this Stanford case stand out from other examples of anti-Semitism that you've seen on campus?
In some ways, it's extraordinary, and in some ways, typical. You know, we've seen so many problems that Jewish students face on campus, and so few administrators who are able to deal with them and willing to deal with them as forcefully as they're willing to address any other form of discrimination. What's interesting about Stanford, and what I think makes it reflective of a much broader trend that we're seeing across higher education and also in other areas, is that the problem here isn't just on the campus. It is in the specific part of campus that is supposed to deal with hate and bias. It is in the diversity, equity, and inclusion program at Stanford. In other words, it's in exactly the program that's supposed to eliminate these problems rather than creating them. It's in the area that students are supposed to go to, or administrators or staff or faculty is supposed to go to if they have a problem, and yet it's generating the problem itself. It is within DEI at Stanford.
Is that a unique issue to Stanford, it being a problem in DEI initiatives specifically, or is that also a trend that's going on where DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, are either ignoring or promulgating anti-Semitism on campus?
We've seen anti-Semitism in DEI programs in other parts of the country at a higher ed level. And of course, it's been in the news when there are tech employees at high level positions in DEI who have been saying things that are clearly anti-Semitic. At Stanford, I would say it's especially serious and severe. It's happened over a significant period of time. It's involved both anti-Jewish stereotypes. It's involved racial segregation. It's involved some of the worst forms of discrimination, something that any community college should understand they can't do. And yet here it is happening at Stanford University, which is supposed to be one of the great universities of the world. And yet they are blundering in an extraordinary way.
Indeed, that is really sad. And you mentioned that this has been going on for a long time. And it's in the news right now that Stanford is investigating claims that in the 1950s and 1960s, the school had a quota for Jews, limiting admission for students of Jewish descent or Jewish faith. Can you contextualize what happened to Jews in higher education in general back then and how things have changed in the decades since? And what is your overall reaction to this investigation? Should we be surprised?
Look, we're taping this just one day after the Supreme Court has fortunately agreed to grant cert and hear oral argument in the Harvard University case. That is a case that reveals the extent to which in the 1930s, Harvard created a program that was specifically designed to exclude Jewish students from admissions. It became extraordinarily influential across the country. It involved things like adopting geographical diversity preferences. Why? So they wouldn't have so many New York and New Jersey Jews. It involves recruiting athletes. Why? Because they thought that fewer Jews would be athletic. It involves a character requirement. Why? Because they assumed that Jews would be of lower character than white Protestants. Lots of different pieces that were all intended to reduce the number of Jews and to protect spots for upper class white people who wouldn't be offended by the presence of Jews and go instead to Princeton or Yale. Many of these programs that were intended to exclude Jews at Harvard have had the continuing effect of excluding Asians at Harvard. And of course, there's now this overlay of racial preference, which brings in still modest numbers of African American and Hispanic students who might otherwise not have been admitted, at the detriment of Asian students or Jewish students or others. Some of these same policies have taken root elsewhere in the country. At Stanford, of course, they came to adopt some of the same indirect Harvard approaches to reducing Jewish student enrollment, but there is now this task force to look into the question as to whether they also had a more direct way of doing it, an actual quota to reduce the Jewish population into the 1950s. And to the extent that they did, of course, that wouldn't have ended in the 1950s, given legacy preferences. The exclusion of Jews from the 1950s would lead to a reduction of student enrollment to the current day. We are encouraged that within 70 years, they have been willing to fess up to the problem and make a change. We hope that now that we have made very clear that they are continuing to discriminate against Jewish students in the year 2022, and not just students, but our cases about staff, administrators, health professionals, we hope it's not going to take another 70 years for them to get to this problem.
Honestly, it's pretty outrageous. And I guess to answer the question, no, we shouldn't be surprised, right? Because this was the case back then, that there were a number of universities who, like you said, like Harvard, that would look for different indirect ways to exclude Jews. And that's actually pretty terrible. Obviously, now we have different ways that universities are either excluding Jews or facilitating terrible narratives about them. Can you talk about how universities handle anti-Semitic acts on campus when they come from the left and from the right? Do they act differently based on the political ideology or the ethnicity of the perpetrator? Is there a double standard here?
We typically find that when universities see right-wing traditional anti-Semitism, swastikas, alt-right groups coming on campus, the sort of extreme right-wing anti-Semitism, administrators are able to deal with that problem generally about as well or about as poorly as they deal with other problems facing other groups. It's typically fairly easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of courage for a university president to speak out against neo-Nazism. That's not a constituency that has political influence within many American universities. So they can typically do something to deal with that sort of problem. Where they're less likely to take action is where the perpetrators appear to be not on the right, where they tend to be on the progressive side, where they may include minorities, where they are connected in a way with a constituency that does have influence on campus. Under those circumstances, administrators are much less courageous because they might actually get pushback from their own constituencies. And so there, one often sees a lack of forceful response. That's why we find we need to hold them accountable, both through public transparency in the media and, where necessary, through legal action in the administrative agencies or courts.
That's really interesting because if, like you said, it doesn't take a lot of courage to call out right-wing anti-Semites, neo-Nazis, swastikas, yet at Stanford, we know that there are allegations of Zoom bombings with swastikas that did go ignored for leftist reasons, for anti-racist reasons, to not draw attention from that. That's pretty outstanding.
That's an excellent point there, because there were swastikas there. And even in that case, where it doesn't take a great deal of courage, there were concerns among Stanford administrators that they shouldn't be distracted from dealing against anti-Black racism by looking at Jewish issues. And so even there, where administrators at other universities would at least be able to deal with the swastika, but even there was an unwillingness to deal with an issue that affected Jewish health professionals and perhaps Jewish students, because they wanted to put their emphasis on other groups.
Do we have this kind of overt discrimination against other groups besides Jewish students and staff and faculty that would at least maybe even give them a slight reason to not divert attention away?
I don't think there's any excuse for this behavior, and yet it's something that we see over and over again. I think part of what's going on may be the ideology held by some DEI officials. What we're seeing now, including through research from the Heritage Foundation and I believe University of Arkansas professor Jay Green, is that if you look at their social media postings, people who are working not in legal compliance and not in something like Title IX protection, where they're actually responding to something like an assault, but the people who are involved in sort of fuzzier campus climate type issues within DEI are overwhelmingly ideologically obsessed with Israel. It was an extraordinary study that looked at the social media accounts of DEI professionals and found that there were several times more tweets dealing with Israel than with China, despite the wide range of issues that one might have been speaking out against China. And that of the social media activity from these professionals, when they talked about Israel, unlike China, they were overwhelmingly anti-Israel. So what we have here, and this is something that you might have guessed, because it certainly is consistent with anecdotal evidence and our on-campus experience, is that within these programs, one often finds a kind of a knee-jerk anti-Zionism, which is part of a package of progressive views, which is simply a part of the climate on campus, but especially within some of these DEI groups. It crosses the line from political opinion into anti-Semitism and becomes a form of hate or bias. And it essentially poisons the environment within these programs so that they become, in their own way, as toxic as the environments that they are supposed to make better.
I do believe we actually did recently cover this story on campus reform. We also covered the study that the Heritage Foundation came out with, which did show that 244 on-campus anti-Semitic incidents were reported throughout the 2020-2021 school year, which represented a 34.8% increase from the year before. I'd love to get your reaction on this, and why in the world would we see such an increase despite significantly less on-campus interaction due to COVID?
Yeah, a lot of people might have thought going into COVID that with closed campuses, we would have less campus anti-Semitism, but it's been the worse. It's been the opposite. It's been worse. We're seeing a few things. As classes went online, anti-Semitism also went online. As nerves frayed by isolation influenced individuals, the campus climate got worse. And often one saw a greater political extremism that sometimes went over the line into racism or anti-Semitism. We also saw that at the end of the last school year, at a time when in the past students might have simply packed their bags, moved off campus, and put their university life aside, since everything was online, one saw perhaps even an increase as opposed to an end to the anti-Israel and also anti-Semitic activity. So one saw that what had been cyclical in the past, with incidents rising and falling with the progress of the academic year, now what we found is that campus anti-Semitism has been more year-round, that it continues during summer break, during winter break, so on and so forth, and that while there haven't been so much of the physical altercation that one might have seen, the dialogue is much coarser, much more extreme. The political polarization much greater. And yes, we have seen of all sorts, from the non-serious to the extremely serious, definitely a worsening of this problem, especially, of course, in May, during the period that surrounded the Gaza conflict, when many news reports were dealing with Israel, and we saw Jewish Americans attacked in the streets of New York, Southern California, and Florida. The campus situation got dramatically worse during that period, but it didn't let let out in June, July, August, and continued worsening, especially, of course, on the left.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And these students, because it's a lot of the students who are propagating these anti-Semitic tropes, these pro-Palestine to the point of being anti-Jew, not just anti-Israel Israel tropes, but the students have to learn it from somewhere, and it either comes from home or the classroom. So, would you characterize anti-Semitism on college campuses as systemic or institutional? And I'm talking not just in one specific incident.
We often see that the source of the problem is not just with the students, but with the professors, as well as the DEI and other professionals. Sometimes it starts just with a political extremism, which can be speech, but then it goes over various lines. And we do see that it is the professionals and faculty members who are not just there for 4 or 7 years, but who may be there for their entire career. And they are influencing the students often in a very bad direction.
When did that begin, where you have professors really influencing these students with these very, very anti-Israel, which borders on and even crosses the line of anti-Semitism? Because that doesn't seem like that has always been the case. That seems like it's actually been getting worse lately.
So I think that we saw it on some campuses, even 20 years ago, certainly with the start of the second Intifada. So the period right around 9/11 and shortly after that. That's when I think we started seeing it at a level that one couldn't simply dismiss as being 1 or 2 extremist professors, but that it's increased throughout the last 20 years. And I would say the rate of increase has been expanding. That is to say, the amount of extremism and the extent to which it goes over lines has certainly gotten worse and worse over even the last just few years, and certainly the last many months over the COVID period.
So this has definitely been a problem over the last 20 years, and there really needs to be some kind of a solution. So what do schools have to do differently to make Jewish students feel safe to practice their faith openly? And that includes all tenets of their faith, including Zionism.
I think they need to make sure that students of all faith are able to express themselves both religiously and also culturally, and they need to do this for every member of their faith communities as strongly as they do for other groups. They need to break down the division between DEI, which is often thought of as being for racial and ethnic minorities, versus religious life. There are different names at different universities, but there are often groups that deal with faith issues. They're handled very differently. They need to provide the same level of protections for students of faith, regardless of their religion. And they need to understand that for some, what you might call ethno-religious groups, like Jewish students, for many of them, their identity might be a religious identity. For some of them, their identity might be expressed in other ways. For instance, in a commitment to the state of Israel that they might describe as a Zionist. And universities need to make clear that Jewish students, like students of other faith, other communities, need to be able to express their identities the same as everyone else, and that there will be no favored and disfavored groups. There won't be some groups that are given special protection and other groups that are disregarded. We can't have a situation where there are some groups that might have a progressive constituency and might have greater favor in the administration, and others that are not. There needs to be an even-handedness within the administration, and there needs to be a strong outreach to all.
So can you explain what the Brandeis Center specifically, for those who aren't already aware, what the Brandeis Center is doing to combat anti-Semitism in higher education, like we see all over?
Sure. A decade ago, I founded the Louis D. Brandeis Center to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. We specifically fight anti-Semitism on college campuses. We represent Jewish students, Jewish faculty, Jewish staff and administrators in cases where they have been harassed and bullied or marginalized or excluded, where there have been efforts to impeach or cancel them from student government positions because they are considered politically incorrect. We represent them to the administration, and we explain to the administration how they can make corrections, what they need to do. We work with them to try to achieve voluntary resolutions. And when they are unwilling to do that, we may hold them accountable legally. In other cases, where administrators are genuinely willing to step forward and do the right thing, we will train administrators on what they can do and how they can do things right.
Oh, that's great to hear. Where can viewers find the work you guys are doing?
Well, thank you for asking that, Peter. We're at BrandeiScenter.com. Brandeis, like Justice Louis D. Brandeis, Brandeis Center.com.
Perfect. Okay, everyone, please go check that out. Thank you for all you do to combat anti-Semitism on and off campus, and especially for taking the time to join Campus Reform today to talk about it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Peter.